Imagine you're pregnant, alone, trying to survive in New York after the man who promised you the world disappeared the moment you needed him most. Imagine that in a moment of exhaustion, you make a mistake, small, stupid, impossible to undo. You send a photo of your ultrasound to the wrong contact, and that wrong contact sends a helicopter. This is the story of Merritt and Hyun-Sung Yoon. Two wounded people who learned to hide so well that even they no longer knew where the scar was. Until that night. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Hit the red button and turn on the bell. Every week there's a new story here, and you won't want to miss what's coming. And tell me in the comments, would you send the message back? Or would you stay quiet and hope he forgot? Merritt turned 29 on a Tuesday in February, and nobody at Yoon Capital remembered. That was fine. She hadn't told anyone. That was also fine. She'd spent the last 7 years building a version of herself that didn't need much. Didn't need parties, didn't need noise, didn't need anyone to show up with a cake. She had her work. She had her apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Harlem that smelled faintly of her neighbor's cooking every evening around 6. She had a plant named Gerald that somehow refused to die despite her neglect. And now, as of 14 weeks ago, she had something else growing inside her that also refused to cooperate with her plans. She'd found out on a Monday. She'd told the father on a Wednesday. He was gone by Friday. Not gone like a slow disappearance. Gone like a magic trick. Here, then not. Number disconnected. Instagram account deleted. 4 years of something that felt like love. Erased the way you erase a mistake on paper. Firmly, completely, leaving only a faint pressure mark behind. His name was Dominic. She hadn't said it out loud in 3 months. She didn't plan to start now. Story had been working at Yoon Capital for 2 years and 4 months. She was an executive assistant to Hyun-Sung Yoon, CEO, which meant she was, in practical terms, the left hand he used when he didn't want to use his right one. She managed his calendar, his correspondence, his travel, his emergencies. She filtered his world. She made the impossible feel routine. She did all of this with a precision that other assistants quietly resented and senior staff quietly depended on. What she did not do was get personal. She did not share details of her life. She did not accept invitations to team dinners. She did not linger after meetings. She arrived early. She left late. She got the job done. And she went home. She was 14 weeks pregnant, and not a single person in that office knew. She planned to keep it that way for as long as professionally possible. She was not showing yet. Barely a whisper of change in her silhouette. Easy to hide under the structured blazer she favored. She had a plan. She was always making plans. Plans were the scaffolding she'd built her life around after the accident of her childhood, after her mother's leaving, after Dominic. Plans were what kept the floor from dropping out. What she did not plan for was the Thursday. It had been a long week even by the standards of working for Hyun-Sung Yoon. There had been a shareholder meeting that ran 4 hours over schedule, a merger negotiation that collapsed on Tuesday and had to be rebuilt by Wednesday morning, and a flight to Chicago that got canceled, rerouted, and eventually abandoned in favor of a 3-hour conference call that Story had to coordinate across 4 time zones while standing in the middle of a parking garage because the office building had lost Wi-Fi. By Thursday evening, she was running on 3 hours of sleep, weak tea, and something that might generously be described as spite. She was sitting at her desk at 8:47 p.m., the office empty around her, going through her phone with one hand and eating crackers with the other, the only food she could reliably keep down these days. She'd had a prenatal appointment that morning. Everything was fine. The baby was fine. She had a new ultrasound image saved to her phone, small and blurry and impossibly real. She'd been meaning to send it to her sister, Simone. Simone was the only person who knew. Simone had been asking for an update since Monday. Story opened her contacts, typed S, tapped the first name that appeared, attached the image, hit send, set her phone face down on the desk and went back to her crackers. She didn't look at her phone again for 11 minutes. When she did, there was a message waiting. It was not from Simone. The name at the top of the thread was one she saw every day on meeting invitations, on contracts, on the glass panel beside the corner office door. Hyun-Sung Yoon. Her body went cold from the neck down. She stared at the conversation. Her ultrasound, sent at 8:47 p.m., and below it, his response, sent at 8:52 p.m. 5 words. Come to me. Right now. Story put the cracker down. She picked the phone up, stared, put it down again, stood up, sat down, pressed both palms flat on the desk and focused on breathing, which had become something she had to consciously remember to do. Her mind ran the situation in seconds. He'd received her ultrasound. He'd seen it. He'd read the sender's name and realized it was her. And his response, not a question, not a confused reply, not a polite pretense that he hadn't seen it, was 5 words that sounded like an order. Come to me, right now. Who did he think he was? She typed back, there's been a mistake. Wrong contact. Please disregard. His response came in under 40 seconds. I know it was a mistake. Come anyway. Story stood up from her desk so fast, the chair rolled into the cabinet behind her. She was not going anywhere. She was going home. She was going to call Simone, eat something that wasn't a cracker, and deal with this, professionally, calmly, in the morning. She was going to pretend this was a minor administrative error and handle it the way she handled everything. Efficiently, without emotion, and alone. She was reaching for her coat when the intercom on her desk crackled. The building's front desk, the night security guard, whose name was Terry, and who brought her coffee sometimes on late nights because he said she looked like she was keeping the whole building alive by herself. Miss Merritt, there's a pause. She could hear Terry's professional composure straining. There's a helicopter on the roof. The pilot says he's here for you. Story stood very still. Then she put her coat on, picked up her bag, and went upstairs. Not because she was going to do what Hyun-Sung Yoon wanted, because she was furious, and fury, in her experience, needed somewhere to go. Hyun-Sung Yoon was 34 years old, and he had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. Surprise required a gap between what you expected and what actually happened. He'd spent the better part of his adult life closing that gap, studying people, reading rooms, anticipating problems before they became crises. It was the skill that had built Yoon Capital from a mid-sized asset management firm into something that made other firms nervous when they saw it on the opposing side of a deal. He was on a plane back from Seoul when the image arrived. He'd been awake for 22 hours. The seat around him was scattered with documents, the remains of a week of meetings with his father's associates, a week of dinners where every conversation was really about something other than the conversation. A week of being the representative of a family legacy he'd spent 15 years quietly, carefully reshaping into something he could actually respect. He'd picked up his phone to check a message from his CFO, and there it was. An ultrasound, from Merritt. He looked at it for a long time. The plane hummed around him. Someone in first class was watching a film with the volume too high. He was aware of none of it. The image was small and granular the way those images always were. A gray landscape of static with a shape in the middle that was somehow unmistakably, impossibly a person. A curved spine. A head. Something that would become hands. He had seen an image like this exactly once before. 3 years, 7 months, and 11 days ago. He did not let himself go there. He was good at not going there. He'd built entire internal architecture dedicated to not going there. He redirected, the way he always did, focused on the immediate, the practical, the present. Merritt, his assistant, 2 years and 4 months of exceptional, invisible, impeccable work. A person he'd gradually come to think of as indispensable in the way good infrastructure was indispensable. You only noticed it when it wasn't there. He knew her professionally, with a thoroughness that surprised him sometimes. He knew almost nothing about her personally. He hadn't known she was pregnant. He found, sitting at 30,000 feet somewhere over the Pacific, that this bothered him in a way he was not prepared to examine. He typed 5 words. He sent the helicopter. Then he sat back and waited for whatever came next. She walked into his office like she was walking into a courtroom. That was the first thing he noticed, the way she carried herself. Not nervous, not apologetic, not the careful, professionally neutral version of Story Merritt he saw every morning over a stack of briefings. This was a different configuration of the same person, and the difference was in the jaw. Set. Decided. The particular posture of someone who has decided they are not the one who should be uncomfortable in this room. She stopped in the center of his office and looked at him. It was an accident. He was sitting behind his desk, still in his travel clothes from the flight, jacket over the chair behind him. He'd beaten her here by 40 minutes, faster than the helicopter, but only because he'd rerouted the landing. I know it was. Then I don't understand why I'm here. He looked at her steadily. Because I asked you to come. You sent a helicopter. Yes. That's not asking. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite anything. You're right. I apologize for the method. A beat. Why didn't you tell me? There it was. Story had seen it coming from the moment she stepped off the elevator, and she still wasn't ready for it. The question asked as if he had a right to the answer, as if there were something she owed him beyond the 2 years of flawless work she'd already given. Tell you what, exactly? My medical history, my personal life. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. I don't recall that being in my job description. It isn't. Then we agree. Story. He said her name differently than other people did. Unhurried. Like he'd thought about it before he spoke. I'm not asking as your employer. The room was very quiet. Then I don't know what you're asking as, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She noticed, not for the first time, that silences didn't seem to cost him anything. He sat in them the way other people sat in comfortable chairs. Are you all right? He said it carefully, like the question was made of something fragile. She opened her mouth, closed it. Something moved through her chest that she didn't have a name for. Not anger, not grief, not exactly. Something that lived between the two. I'm fine, she said. You're 14 weeks pregnant and you've been working 80-hour weeks. 12-hour days. The math is different. Story. Mr. Yoon. Another silence. This one had more weight to it. You can go home, he said finally. I'll have a car take you. He paused. I'd like to talk tomorrow, if you're willing. She considered telling him she wasn't willing. Considered telling him that whatever he thought this situation required from either of them, she had it handled. And handled meant she didn't need him to be involved. Instead, she just nodded. Once. And left. She sat in the back of the car he'd sent and stared out at the city moving past. The yellow blur of streetlights, the dark windows of buildings, New York doing its indifferent, relentless thing, and told herself she was fine. She almost believed it. The conversation the next morning lasted 45 minutes and was, by any external measure, professional. Measured. 2 adults addressing a logistical situation with competence and restraint. Internally, it was something else entirely. Hyun-Sung told her that he intended to make no changes to her role or her responsibilities, that her position was not at risk, had never been at risk, and that if she chose to continue working through her pregnancy, he would ensure her workload was manageable. He said all of this looking directly at her, the way he always did. That particular quality of attention he had, the kind that made you feel that you were the only thing in the room. Story told him she appreciated it. that she intended to work through the second trimester and evaluate the third, and that she preferred to keep her personal situation personal. He agreed. She went back to her desk. By the following Monday, she noticed that her afternoon briefing stack was 20 minutes lighter, that someone had rearranged her standing Thursday meeting to sit later in the day, after a slot she hadn't realized he knew was her worst hour. 2 p.m., the window where the nausea still sometimes ambushed her, that the case of water in the break room had been replaced with a brand she hadn't asked for, but that she'd mentioned to Simone on a phone call 6 weeks ago was the only one that didn't make her stomach turn. She didn't ask about any of it. She noticed all of it. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was what it cost him. Hyun-Sung was a man who'd learned early that the most dangerous thing you could do was want something too obviously. Not because he'd been taught to hide it. His father, actually, was a man of enormous feeling, poorly concealed. But because he'd watched wanting too much become its own kind of loss. You reached for something, and it moved. You counted on something, and it ended. You let yourself believe in the specific shape of a future, and then the future changed its shape, and you were left holding the outline of something that no longer existed. He'd protected himself with distance. Not coldness. He wasn't cold. People who called him cold didn't know the difference between cold and careful. He was careful, measured. He gave people exactly what the situation required, and kept the rest of himself in a place no one had access to without his explicit, considered invitation. Story Merritt had never been invited. She'd simply arrived, incrementally, over 2 years and 4 months, not through any dramatic entry but through the slow accumulation of presence, the way she handled a crisis at 7 a.m. without losing her composure, the way she laughed at something private when she thought no one was watching, a laugh so different from her professional one that it felt like seeing a room with all the furniture moved, the way she went quiet when she was working through something difficult, not the performed quiet of someone waiting to speak, but genuine internal activity. He could feel it from across a room. He hadn't meant to notice. He'd noticed anyway. And now she was across the hallway in a hospital bed, and he was in a chair by the door. And his chest felt the way it felt at 30,000 feet over the Pacific when he'd first looked at that ultrasound, tight and specific, the feeling of someone gripping something they have no right to grip and doing it anyway. They fell into something. Not friendship. The word was too casual for whatever it was, too soft for the architecture of it. It was more like a mutual recognition, conducted in a language that had no words in it. He brought her coffee he'd started making himself, because she'd once said the office machine tasted like regret. She reorganized his Tuesday schedule without being asked, because she'd watched him leave 3 consecutive Tuesdays with the particular tension in his shoulders that meant the 4 p.m. call was running into his thinking time. They ate lunch in his office sometimes. Not together, exactly. She'd be working, he'd be reading, but in the same room, with the same comfortable silence between them that she'd once associated only with people she'd known for decades. She told herself it was just the pregnancy softening her, making her notice warmth where she usually only tracked logistics. She told herself a lot of things. The secret she didn't know she was carrying was this. Hyun-Sung had been watching her for longer than she thought. Not in any way she would have called inappropriate. Nothing so simple or so clean. It was the kind of watching that happens when you spend years in close proximity to a person and find yourself, against your own will, becoming interested. Not in the surface things. Not in the way a passing attraction works. In the deeper register. The way she thought. The way she held things together without ever making it visible. The way she protected herself so thoroughly that you could be standing right next to her and still feel like there was a door between you, professionally, properly, perfectly locked, and find yourself, somehow, wanting to know what was on the other side. He had never acted on it. He was her employer. The line was clear, but the line had always been drawn on his side, not hers. She hadn't known there was a line to cross because she hadn't known he was standing at it. He found out about the father of her baby on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the ultrasound. She hadn't told him. She'd said the pregnancy was complicated and left the shape of the complication deliberately vague. He hadn't pushed. He'd filed it under things that were not his business, the way he filed many things. But he had a friend, Marcus, a lawyer, one of the few people Hyun-Sung trusted with something approaching actual conversation, who knew someone who knew Dominic. And Marcus, without intending to, said a name at dinner, mentioned a situation, described a man who'd walked away from a pregnancy and a woman and thought that was an acceptable thing to do. Hyun-Sung had put down his glass very carefully. He'd said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. But later, alone in his apartment, he'd thought about Story Merritt eating crackers at her desk at 9 in the evening. Story Merritt taking the subway home at 11 p.m. because she'd told him she preferred it to car services. Story Merritt, 29 years old, 14 weeks pregnant, building something alone with the same calm ferocity with which she built everything. He thought about a man who'd seen all of that and chosen to leave. He didn't have a word for what he felt. He had several, but none of them were words he was in the habit of using. There are things that happen to a person that don't leave scars. Scars, at least, have texture. You can run your finger over them. You can point to them and say, "This is where it happened. This is what it looked like when it closed." What Hyun-Sung carried was different. It was internal, a kind of weight that had no outside surface, nothing you could show anyone, nothing that would have made sense to explain. He'd been 30 years old. Her name was Ji-young, and they had not been in love. Not the way the word was commonly used, not with the softness or the certainty people seemed to expect. They had been something that might have grown into something else, or might not have. He hadn't known yet. She'd told him at 11 weeks. He'd been on a business trip. He'd come home that same day, changed his flight, arrived 12 hours early, and come home. He hadn't come home in time. Not in time for what, exactly, was something the doctors explained in clinical language that he'd stored in some drawer in his mind and never fully opened again. A complication. Sudden. The kind that could not have been predicted, could not have been prevented, would have happened whether he'd been there or whether he'd been on the other side of the world. He knew that, intellectually. He'd been working on believing it for 3 years, 7 months, and some number of days. What he'd taken from it was not grief exactly, though grief was in there, layered somewhere under everything else. What he'd taken was a particular vigilance, an inability to be casual about certain things, a response that triggered somewhere deep and automatic whenever something touched that specific shape of loss. When Story's ultrasound appeared on his phone at 30,000 feet, that response had fired before he'd had time to think. Come to me. Right now. He hadn't been thinking about what it sounded like. He'd been thinking about a gray static image and a curved spine and the specific, irrational terror of being far away. He told her none of this. He wasn't sure he knew how to. He'd spent 3.5 years rebuilding a version of himself that functioned well in the world, that made good decisions, held successful meetings, returned calls promptly, moved through rooms with the right kind of authority. That version of himself did not talk about the drawer, did not open the thing he'd put away in it, did not hand someone else something that fragile and wait to see what they'd do with it. So he made her coffee. He adjusted her schedule. He watched from the careful distance he always kept and told himself that was enough, that it was the appropriate thing, that he was simply looking after an employee who was going through something difficult. He told himself several things. It was a Saturday in April when it happened. Story was 22 weeks along. She was feeling, for the first time in months, something adjacent to okay. The nausea had lifted. She'd started eating real meals again. She'd bought a crib, a white one, simple, that she'd assembled herself on a Sunday afternoon with Gerald the plant watching from the windowsill and a YouTube tutorial on her phone. And the act of building something concrete had made the whole thing feel real, in a way that was terrifying and stabilizing in equal measure. She was alone in her apartment that Saturday evening. Simone had offered to come over. Story had said she was fine. She was always saying she was fine. She'd been on her feet most of the day. Too much. She knew it even while she was doing it. But the apartment needed cleaning, and the grocery run had turned into a longer walk than intended, and she'd come home tired in a way that felt different from ordinary tired. She ate dinner. She sat on the couch. She put on something to watch and wasn't watching it. At 9:17 p.m., she felt something shift. Not pain exactly. More like a wrong note in a familiar song, her body sending a signal she didn't have the vocabulary to read. She sat up straighter, waited. The feeling didn't resolve. She tried to stand, and her knees went sideways. She was on the floor before she'd fully understood she was falling. Not hard, sideways, down against the side of the couch, one hand catching the cushion's edge. She wasn't hurt, but she couldn't get back up. The room was strange and heavy, and her hands were shaking, and she didn't know what was happening to her, but she knew, with a clarity that bypassed thought entirely, that something was wrong. She reached for her phone. Simone didn't pick up. She stared at her contacts. The names moved. She was shaking harder now. She pressed a name. She didn't know, until later, why it was his name she pressed. She didn't try to explain it to herself. Some things happen beneath the level of logic, in a register where the body knows what the mind hasn't admitted. He picked up on the second ring. Story. She meant to say something measured, something that conveyed the situation without alarming him, something professional and calm. What came out instead was, "I'm on the floor." A pause so brief it barely registered. "Are you hurt?" I don't think so. "I just can't. Something feels wrong. I don't know what. I'm coming. Stay on the floor. Don't try to get up. What's your address?" "You don't have to." Story. His voice was quiet, completely steady. The kind of steady that isn't the absence of feeling but the decision to stand in front of it. "Your address." She gave it to him. He was there in 19 minutes. She knew because she counted. Counting was something to do while she lay on her side on the floor with one hand on her stomach, doing the only thing she knew how to do, staying very still and waiting. She heard his knock. She told him the door was unlocked. He came in and crossed the room to her in 3 seconds. She knew it was 3 because she'd stopped counting at the knock and started again without meaning to. He didn't say anything. He came down to her level, knelt on the floor of her apartment without a moment's hesitation, and put one hand gently on her arm and looked at her face in a way that made her feel, suddenly and devastatingly, like she was seen. "Tell me what you're feeling." She told him. The shift, the dizziness, the trembling. He listened without interrupting, without reaching for his phone to call anyone yet, just listening with his entire attention. "Can you move your feet?" She could. She moved them. He nodded. "I'm going to help you sit up." Slowly. It took a while. He was careful in a way she hadn't expected. Not careful the way someone is when they're afraid of doing the wrong thing, but careful the way someone is when they've thought about it, when they know what gentle looks like. When she was upright, back against the couch, he sat on the floor next to her without being asked. Close but not crowding. Present. "We're going to the hospital," he said. "Hyun-Sung. Not a question. I need you to let me do this." She looked at him. In her apartment, on her floor, at 9:30 on a Saturday night. She'd spent months protecting herself from needing anyone. Months building the walls up, making herself sufficient, refusing every hand that reached toward her on the principle that hands reached out could also pull away. He didn't reach toward her. He was just there. Already there. Not asking. "Okay," she said. The hospital room was pale and bright, and smelled the way hospitals smell. Something antiseptic underneath something floral, which managed to be both inoffensive and faintly terrible. Story lay in the bed while the doctors did their work. The monitoring, the questions, the careful examination that she submitted to with her hands folded on her stomach and her face composed into the patient calm she'd mastered years ago, the one that looked like peace and was actually something much harder. Hyun-Sung sat in the chair by the door. She hadn't asked him to stay. He hadn't asked her permission. He'd simply settled into the chair when the nurse guided Story into the room, and there he'd remained, still, quiet, one forearm on the armrest, watching the floor with the particular inward quality he sometimes had, like a person doing important internal work. She found, to her own surprise, that she was glad he was there. She didn't look at him often, but knowing he was in the room was doing something, a kind of stabilization she couldn't account for, an anchor she hadn't known she was missing. The doctor came back at 11:15, low blood pressure, dehydration, a warning about pacing, about rest, about the things a body in the second trimester needed. That Story had been, characteristically, denying it. The baby was fine. The monitoring showed nothing concerning. She would need to stay for a few hours of observation, and then she could go home. The baby was fine. Story heard the whole explanation. Nodded at the right moments. Asked the right questions. And when the doctor left and the room was quiet again, she covered her face with both hands and stayed there for a very long time. She didn't make a sound, but he got up from the chair. He crossed the room. He stood beside the bed, and after a moment, without speaking, he reached out and put his hand, palm up, on the edge of the mattress. Not grabbing, not pulling, just there. She took it. She didn't know who moved first. It didn't matter. Her hand was in his, and she kept her face covered with the other one, and she let herself feel, just for a minute, just inside the parentheses of this room, how close she'd come to something she couldn't name, how alone she'd been in that apartment on the floor, how hard she'd been working at pretending that was fine. When she finally lowered her hands, she looked at him. "You should go," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "You didn't have to come. You definitely don't have to stay." He looked at her for a long time. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the professional composure, not the careful distance. Something rawer, something that looked, around the edges, like it had been there a long time and was only now being allowed in the direction of his expression. "I know," he said. "I'm staying." She almost told him not to. The reflex was there, the familiar, well-practiced impulse to close the door, to say she was fine, to handle it herself. She let the impulse pass. "Why?" she asked instead. Quietly. Genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was far away once," he said, "when I should have been present, and I've been trying not to make that mistake again." She didn't know what he meant. Not yet. But the weight in it reached her. The fact that there was a weight at all. That this man who moved through the world with such measured control was carrying something he'd just, without meaning to, let her briefly touch. "Okay," she said, for the second time that night. He sat back down in the chair. She lay back against the pillow. The room was quiet. Not the empty kind of quiet. The kind that has something in it. The kind that is, in its way, a form of company. They kept her until 2 a.m. By then, the waiting room outside had emptied, and the hospital had settled into its late-night register. Softened footsteps, lower voices, the particular stillness of a building running on reduced occupancy. The car he'd called was downstairs. He rode up in the elevator with her and walked her to her door and stood in the hallway while she unlocked it. And the normalness of it, the simple human proximity of a person making sure another person arrived somewhere safely, was something that moved through her, like something she'd forgotten she'd needed. "He left," she said. She wasn't sure she'd intended to say it out loud. It came out quietly, facing the door, key still in her hand. "The father." She turned around, leaned against the doorframe, looked at him directly, which was the only way she'd ever known how to do things. "I told him I was pregnant. By the end of the week, he was gone. Blocked. Disconnected. Everything." A pause. "I've never said that out loud to anyone who didn't already know." He held her gaze. There was no shock on his face, no pity. Something more careful than that. A quality of listening that gave the words enough space to just exist, to not immediately require management or resolution. "He was afraid," she said. "Or weak. I've decided those are the same thing." She exhaled. "I'm not angry at him anymore. I was for a long time. Now I'm mostly just clear about what kind of person he is, about the fact that my baby doesn't need that kind of person." "You're sure?" He asked it carefully. About the anger, or about the baby not needing him?" "Both." She thought about it honestly. "Yes, to both." He nodded once, then he made a mistake. 2 words, 4 syllables. She'd heard more elaborate comfort from more practiced sources. She'd received speeches about resilience and strength, and the things people said when they didn't know what else to offer. None of it had hit her the way this did, because it wasn't comfort. It wasn't consolation. It was a verdict, delivered with complete certainty. He made a mistake. Not, "You'll be fine." Not, "You're so strong." Just the simple, clear assessment. He was wrong to go, and the wrongness is his, not yours. Something loosened in her chest. Something she hadn't known she was holding. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway." She stood there in her doorway for a moment longer. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea. You can tell me what you meant earlier, about being far away when you should have been present." He looked at her. "You don't have to tell me," she added. I'm not trading. I told you because I wanted to, not because you owe me anything in return." "I know," he said. A pause. "I'd like to come in." She made tea. He sat on the couch, Gerald the plant on the windowsill behind him, the white crib visible through the bedroom doorway, the city outside moving quietly past as it always did, indifferent and constant. He told her about Ji-young. He didn't tell it dramatically. There were no flourishes, no performed emotion. He told it the way a person tells something they've held alone for a long time, carefully, a little roughly, stopping sometimes to find the right word. He told her they hadn't been in love in the way people meant the word, that it had been something more ambiguous, a warm proximity, a shared context, a relationship that might have become something or might have remained what it was. He told her he didn't know what it would have grown into, and that the not knowing was its own particular texture of grief, because you couldn't mourn what you'd lost when you didn't know what you'd had. He told her that he'd gotten the call while sitting in a conference room in Tokyo, that he'd excused himself mid-sentence, mid-meeting, walked to the lobby, booked the first flight out, that he'd sat on that plane for 3 hours doing the math compulsively, departure plus flight time plus transit, the calculation that would tell him when he'd arrive, as if arriving faster could change the arithmetic of what had already happened. He told her that when he finally walked into the hospital, a doctor had met him in the hallway. Not in a room, in the hallway, which was when he understood. He didn't describe what came after. She didn't ask him to. He told her about the months that followed. The way work had become the only architecture he trusted, because work had rules and outcomes and cause and effect, and none of it asked anything of him that he couldn't give by just showing up and being competent. He told her that he'd gotten very good at functioning, that functioning was not the same as living, but it looked similar from a distance, and distance was where he'd kept most people. He told her about the ultrasound, about looking at it on the plane. "I didn't know it was you at first," he said. "I mean, I saw your name. I knew. But the part of me that reacted..." He stopped. That part was just looking at the image, at the shape of it. And it was like... He paused again, longer. Like something that had been closed for a long time trying to remember how to open. Story held her mug with both hands and said nothing. She was very good at the kind of silence that made space. "I've been afraid," he said. "Since then. That getting close to something like this again. You might lose it again," she finished. "Yes. That's not irrational," she said. "That's just what happens when you've lost something." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "Knowing doesn't make it less present." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He told her what the doctor had said, what he'd done with it, what he'd spent 3.5 years trying to do with it. She listened the way he'd listened to her, without interrupting, without reaching for resolution. When he finished, the tea was cold, and the city outside had gone quieter, and the room felt different, not heavier, more honest, more furnished, somehow, with the real things. "That's why the helicopter," she said. "Yes." "And the water, the schedule, all of it." He didn't deny it. "I told myself it was professional concern. And now?" A pause that was different from his other pauses, weightier. Chosen. "Now I think I was lying to myself." Story looked at him. This man who had sent a helicopter and sat on a hospital floor and told her a true thing at 2 a.m. in her apartment, the city humming quietly outside. "Okay," she said. It was the 3rd time she'd said it that night. Each time it had meant something different. This time it meant, "I hear you. I'm still here. I'm not running." He left at 3. She walked him to the door. At the threshold he stopped. "Can I ask you something?" "You just told me your most private thing," she said. "Yes." "Are you afraid? About doing this alone?" She thought about lying. It would have been easy. She was good at it. "Every day," she said. "But I'm more afraid of needing someone who leaves, so I got good at not needing." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I don't leave," he said quietly. Not as a promise exactly. As a statement of fact, the way he said things he'd already decided. She let that sit in the air between them. "Good night, Hyun-Sung," she said. "Good night, Story." Spring moved through New York the way it always did, reluctantly at first, then all at once. The trees in Central Park went from bare to green in what felt like a single weekend. The light changed. The city shifted its weight. Story. Merritt turned 23 weeks pregnant and learned how to let someone help her. It didn't happen cleanly. It was not a decided thing, not a moment she could point to and say, "Here, this is where I changed." It was gradual. The slow permitting of proximity. The incremental lowering of the careful structure she'd built. He came over on Sunday afternoons sometimes. He brought food. Always too much. Always something she hadn't asked for but somehow wanted. He sat in her living room and read while she slept, which she'd started doing again. Real sleep. The long, restorative kind she'd been denying herself for months. She'd wake up and find him still there, and the fact of his presence when she opened her eyes was something she'd stopped trying to analyze. She went to his office sometimes in the evenings when the building had emptied. She sat across from him and they talked, not about work, or not only about work, about his childhood and soul, about the weight of a family name, about the specific loneliness of being expected to be everything in every room, about her mother's leaving when she was 9, about Simone, who was 5 years younger and had always been the one who laughed easier, loved louder, landed softer, about what it cost to be the one who didn't. They talked about the baby. She'd found out, at 20 weeks, that she was having a girl. She'd told Simone first. Then, a day later, she'd told him. He'd been very still for a moment. Then he'd said, "That's good," with something in his voice that she was beginning to recognize. The particular register he used when something mattered more than he was prepared to admit. She asked him once, a Thursday evening, quiet office, rain against the windows, whether he'd thought about what it would mean. The paternity question that neither of them had directly addressed since that first night. He looked up from what he was reading. "I have," he said. "And there's a simple way to know. A test." Yes. She'd considered it, back when she was trying to work out the math of a timeline that wasn't entirely simple, that had an overlap she'd preferred not to look at too directly. There had been a night, 5 months ago, the work trip to Hong Kong, a conversation that had run too late, and then later still, the kind of thing that could be categorized as nothing if you were committed to the categorization. She'd been committed to the categorization. "If we did the test," she said slowly, "and it said she was yours, what would that change?" He put down what he was reading. "Nothing that isn't already changing," he said. She looked at him. "And if it said she wasn't?" The same answer. She studied his face. He was not the kind of man who said things imprecisely. He was not performing. He meant both answers in exactly the same way, and the equivalence was the point. "Then why do the test?" she asked. A pause. "Because you deserve to know," he said. "Not for my sake, for yours." They did the test. It was non-invasive. It took 3 weeks for the results. She was at her desk on a Tuesday when the notification arrived on her phone. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she got up, walked down the hall, knocked on his office door. He looked up. "She's yours," Story said. He was very still. She watched something move through his face. Not surprise, not triumph, nothing so simple. Something older and more complicated. The particular expression of a person receiving something they had not allowed themselves to want, because wanting it felt like tempting something that had already been taken from them once. Story. "I know," she said. "I know there's a lot we haven't said yet, and I'm not standing here expecting anything. You should know that. What I said before, about not needing." "Stop," he said, quietly. He stood up from behind the desk. "And let me say something." She stopped. "I'm not here because of the result," he said. "I want you to understand that. I was already here. He stopped. Seemed to recalibrate. "I've been trying to do this at the right speed, not to push, because you've had enough people who moved too fast in the wrong direction." She could feel her pulse. "And now?" she asked. "Now I think," he said, "that I would like to stop pretending that Sunday afternoons are professional courtesy." She felt the laugh before she heard it, a short, surprised thing, coming up from somewhere that had been very quiet for a long time. "They're not," she confirmed. "No," he agreed, a beat. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I'm good at a lot of things, but this—" "Neither do I," he said. "I've been careful for a long time." "Same." "Then maybe we're even," he said. And there it was, the thing that almost never appeared on his face, full and unguarded. The smile she'd seen once, 3 months ago, in a moment she'd been trying to think about less. "We can figure it out slowly, together." She crossed the office, stopped 2 feet from him, looked up. "Together is a big word," she said. "I know what it means," he said. She believed him. She went back to her desk that afternoon and sat with the quiet for a while. Her hands were still. The city went on outside the window with its usual indifference to personal moments. She thought about the last several months, the careful choreography of it, the way they'd orbited each other with so much consideration that the consideration itself had become its own kind of intimacy. She thought about the Hong Kong trip 5 months ago. She'd filed it away under a category labeled, "Don't examine this." She'd been good at not examining it. It was, objectively, a category error. The wrong thing at the wrong time in a situation with too many complications already. They'd both known it when it was happening. They'd looked at each other the next morning over terrible hotel coffee with matching expressions of, well, and then they'd done what two professional, careful people did with something like that. They'd folded it up and put it somewhere and gone back to the work. What she hadn't accounted for was that some things, once folded, still occupy space. She looked up from her desk. Through the glass wall of the hallway, she could see his office. He was standing at his window, back to her, looking at the city the way he sometimes did when he was thinking through something he hadn't finished yet. She watched him for a moment. She thought about a man who'd built his entire internal architecture around not being too far away again, who'd sent a helicopter not out of arrogance but out of a terror so old and specific that he probably hadn't even had a name for it in the moment, who'd sat in a chair by a hospital room door for 5 hours without being asked to, without needing anything for it, just because she was in the room and he'd decided to be present. She thought about the Sunday afternoons, the terrible cooking he was working on, the way he listened, the way he said things only when he'd already decided they were true. She thought about what Simone had said once, years ago, about love not being a feeling that arrived, but a decision you kept making, quietly, in the same direction, until one day you looked up and realized how far you'd traveled. She got up from her desk, walked down the hall, knocked once. He turned from the window. "I've been thinking," she said, "about Hong Kong." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. He was too careful for surprise. More like a door opening inward. "We both decided to file that away," she said. "We did. I think I'd like to unfile it." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, somewhere below, New York went about its business, a siren, distant, traffic. The permanent, indifferent hum of the city that had witnessed 10,000 things like this, and none exactly like this. Story. The way he said her name, unhurried, like he'd thought about it first. "I know," she said. "I'm still a little afraid." "I know," he said. "So am I. But I'm more afraid," she said slowly, "of spending another year pretending that Sunday afternoons are professional courtesy." His mouth moved, that thing that wasn't quite a smile but was the direction of one. "They're not," he said. "No," she said. "They're really not." She stayed in his office for a while, not for any reason that needed justifying. Because she wanted to. Because wanting to was, it turned out, something she was allowed to do. The summer came. Story was 31 weeks pregnant when they had their first real fight, about something small, as first real fights tend to be. He'd made a decision about something touching her pregnancy without consulting her first, a medical referral, motivated entirely by care, and executed without checking whether care was what she wanted, or whether she wanted to be involved in the decision. She'd been calmly furious. He'd been stubbornly certain he'd done the right thing. They'd gone 3 hours without speaking. And then she'd found a note on her desk. No apology. He knew better than that. Had figured out early that she received apologies as erasures, attempts to rewind rather than to move forward. Just a note that said, "You should have been the one to decide. It won't happen again." She'd put the note in her drawer. She'd walked down the hall and knocked on his door. They'd talked. Not smoothly. There was nothing smooth about two people learning each other's edges, both of them practiced in the art of not needing and having to unlearn it in real time. But honestly, with the kind of patience that is not the absence of frustration, but the decision to stay anyway. That, she would decide later, was when it became real. Not the hospital, not the result, not the Sunday afternoons. The moment they stayed in a difficult conversation and came out the other side still facing each other. In August, on a Saturday, she told Simone. Simone cried, which Story had expected. What she hadn't expected was Simone saying, through the crying, "You sound different. You sound like you." Story had thought about that for days. She thought maybe Simone was right. Maybe what she'd been doing for the past several years, the independence, the walls, the relentless self-sufficiency, had been survival, had been necessary, had gotten her through, and maybe what was happening now was something else. Not the end of strength, not a capitulation, just the discovery that you could be strong and also let someone stand next to you, that the two weren't opposites, that she'd been so afraid of needing that she'd forgotten there was a version of wanting that didn't have anything to do with need. He met Simone in September. Simone, who trusted no one, who had been Story's fiercest protector since their mother left, who had spent 3 years silently hating Dominic and 2 months professionally suspicious of Hyun-Sung. Simone shook his hand and looked at him, and looked at her sister, and said nothing. Later, in the kitchen, she'd grabbed Story's arm and said, "He looks at you like you're the whole argument." What does that mean? Like you're the thing he'd say if someone asked him to prove that good things exist. Story had stood in her kitchen and felt something she didn't have a word for. Something warm and terrifying and true. November. 39 weeks. Story had stopped working at 36, at Hyun-Sung's suggestion and her own body's quiet insistence. She'd handed over her responsibilities in stages, efficiently, thoroughly, the way she did everything. And then she'd gone home to the apartment, where the white crib stood assembled in the bedroom, and Gerald the plant had been moved to the living room to make space. And she'd done the thing she'd never been good at. She'd rested. She'd let herself be taken care of. He came over every evening. He brought dinner he'd learned to make. Not well, not yet, but with a sincerity that made the results irrelevant. He sat with her. He talked to her and listened to her, and sometimes they sat together without talking at all. The city outside doing its thing, the room doing its quieter thing, and the silence between them by this point was something so comfortable she carried it with her even when he wasn't there. The baby arrived on a Thursday, which felt right. Thursdays had always been the day things happened in this story. It was a long labor, 12 hours. He was there for all of it, not performing presence, not making it about himself, just genuinely, steadily there in the way she'd learned he was capable of being. He held her hand when she wanted it, and stepped back when she didn't, and said nothing unnecessary, and everything right. At 4:47 a.m., their daughter arrived. She had a full head of dark hair and an expression of complete outrage at the state of things, which Story found entirely relatable. They named her Ren. Story's choice. He'd said, "Whatever you want." She'd said, "I want you to want something too." He'd said, after a moment, "Something small and strong." She'd said, "Ren." He'd said, "Yes." In the first hour, after the doctors and the nurses and the procedures, in the brief private window before the world fully arrived, Hyun-Sung held Ren for the first time. Story watched him. She'd seen him in boardrooms. She'd seen him in airports and late offices and on her living room floor at 3 a.m. with a cup of cold tea. She'd seen him composed, and she'd seen him raw, and she'd seen the versions in between. She'd never seen him like this. Something had gone out of him that she hadn't realized he was still carrying. The last held breath of 3.5 years, finally released. He looked at this small person in his arms with an expression that had no category, not happiness exactly. Something deeper than that. something that had been prepared for by grief and shaped by time and was now arriving, finally, with no more waiting required. He looked up at Story. She looked back. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. 6 months after Ren arrived, Story went back to work. Not to the same role. Something different. Something she'd designed herself. She ran her own small consulting practice, working with 3 clients, managing her hours around a daughter who was demanding and luminous and constantly, furiously awake. She and Hyun-Sung were not perfectly calibrated. They were 2 careful people learning to be less careful, which was sometimes graceful and sometimes not. They disagreed about things. They irritated each other in the specific ways that only proximity produces. They had conversations that required more than one try to get right. But they had the conversations. That was the thing. They stayed in the room. They came out the other side, still facing each other. One evening in May, Ren asleep in her room, Gerald the plant resettled on the windowsill now that the crib occupied its old spot. The city outside doing its late spring version of the thing it always did. Story came into the living room and found Hyun-Sung attempting to install a shelf. It was not going well. He had the instruction sheet and 2 different tools and the expression of a person discovering, in real time, a gap in their competencies. "And there are 6 more steps," she said. "I'm aware. You've been on step 2 for 20 minutes. Also aware." She sat on the couch and watched him. He felt her watching and looked up. "You could help," he said. "I could," she agreed. "But you look very determined." "I am very determined." "It shows." He gave her a look, the dry, affectionate version she'd come to know well, the one that meant she was being entertained but he wasn't going to admit it. She laughed. It came up easy, from somewhere deep and uncomplicated, the kind of laugh that knows it's safe. He stopped what he was doing, looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. The way he said it sometimes, that weighted nothing, that contained the thing he wasn't going to fit into smaller words. She knew what it meant. She'd learned his language the way you learn a place you've decided to live in, gradually, then completely. "Come here," she said. He set down the tools. He came and sat next to her on the couch, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the unfinished shelf together. "We'll finish it tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You'll need a different drill bit." "Probably." Outside, the city. Inside, the quiet. Down the hall, Ren. Here on this couch, the 2 of them, 2 careful people who'd spent years building walls and had, in the end, built something else instead. Something better. Something with windows and a door that opened both ways. This was not what Story had planned. She'd stopped minding. If you made it this far, you know this story was never just about an ultrasound sent by mistake. It was about 2 people who learned, the hard way, that rebuilding isn't the same as starting over. It was about what happens when 2 wounded people decide, slowly, carefully, with no guarantees, to stay. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment. What was the moment that hit you hardest? Until the next story.